check your credit report and score with all three credit reference agencies once a year.
I feel like I am now a credit scores expert, thanks to you. Welcome to another episode of A Little Bit Richer, brought to you by my friends at Legal & General. Here with me to deep dive on this is John Webb from the credit reference agency Experian. He's on a mission to help listeners understand more about credit reports and scores. Welcome, John.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming. I'm really excited because credit scores is something that we all know about. We all know what we should be looking at, but we don't know the finer details, which is why you are here to enlighten us. So first things first, let's start with the basics. What is a credit rating and why does it matter?
So I'll set the scene. Your credit report contains all of your financial information. So it's kind of like thinking of it as your financial CV. It has all of your credit accounts, if you're registered on the electoral roll, if you've got any public record information like county court judgments, bankruptcies, electoral roll as well, and financial links to other people. So it contains lots of information, but there isn't just one credit report. You have three, because there are three credit reference agencies. And so you've got your credit report, and what comes from that is each credit reference agency will give you a credit score. That's, what we call the credit rating. And it's a number that really represents your credit worthiness. It's a serious term, but it's how well you have managed your credit accounts over the past 6 years. So that's what that is. And why it's really important is that when you want to apply for credit, a lender will check the information on your credit report, usually with one of the credit reference agencies, and then that helps them make a decision about whether or not you get the account, but also what the interest rate and how much will they lend to you. So that's why it's really important. Your credit score is a really good indicator of how likely they are to judge that information. So, do they think you've performed well managing your credit accounts, like paying on time, for example?
A financial CV is a great way to put it.
There you go.
I love that.
Coined the term.
I love that. You mentioned that there are more than one credit reference agency. Could you tell us what those agencies are?
Sure. So there's Experian, which I'm from, and there is Equifax and TransUnion. I would generally suggest that you check your credit report, which you could do for free. It's called your statutory credit report. Check your credit report as well, not just your score. Your score is a really great indicator of how you're performing, but you need to see the information that's on your report. So check your free statutory credit report with all three credit reference agencies. If you do that first, you know the information, you know where you stand, you can check any issues, and you kind of get an idea of where to improve. And that gives you a way to monitor how things are going. Also, you can keep an eye on whether or not there's any information that shouldn't be there, but definitely check them before you apply for credit. And I would probably say a couple of months before you do so. That gives you plenty of time to figure out if there's any areas you can improve or if there's anything that needs querying or disputing, and it gives you time to get that sorted before you apply, because the last thing you want is to apply for something and possibly get refused or just end up paying more interest on something because your credit score isn't quite where you need it to be.
It's so interesting to know, but these are the things that we need to know when it comes to your credit scores.
Exactly. The other thing is there's lots of third-party companies as well that offer free credit reports and scores. Now, they're fine to use and no problem at all, but they will get their information from one of those three credit reference agencies. So the really important thing actually is to just know where they get their information from, because if you check two or three of them, but actually they all get their information from the same credit reference agency, then you're not seeing anything different, and there might be slight differences between your credit report.
Absolutely. I think that's a really good insight. I remember when I first checked my credit score, and I was shocked at the amount of information the credit reference agencies knew about me. So how do credit reference agencies like Experian get this information, and what do they share with other companies?
The serious part of this is that lenders share information with us so that when you apply for credit, other lenders can also see the information so that they can make responsible lending decisions. So when you apply for credit, the lender will see the information on your credit report, puts you in the best position to be able to get the next thing you want to apply for, which, especially if it's something big like a mortgage, then you stand a much better chance of getting it because you've got a really positive track record of repaying credit on time.
What does and does not affect your credit rating? And how far back does this go? Because I know there will be people listening who say, look, today I've kind of got my act together. I know what I'm doing with credit. However, maybe me 2 years ago or 3 or 5 years ago,
Yeah.
I had a few issues with credit. What actually does influence my credit rating, and how long does that hinder me or impact my credit score?
Yeah, so it's actually 6 years is the general rule. So, and I say general rule, sounds a little bit vague, but there can be times where it stays a little bit longer. So if you have a bankruptcy, for example, you might end up with restrictions that keep it on slightly longer, for example. But what I would say in almost all circumstances is 6 years, and that's the history that's on there. Now, when you talk about, okay, I've had issues in the past, then I think the good news is that as time goes on, so once, if you have a missed payment, for example, that will affect you considerably for the first month. Then it will still impact, but slightly less for a year. And then as it drops back, it's 2 years old, 3 years old, 4 years old, has less and less of an impact on your credit score because you're kind of moving away from the most recent history of anything negative. But there's lots of things that impact the credit score in terms of what's on there. And primarily they're based around a few things. So the first is repaying on time every month. That's great. Great for your score. If you don't, that can negatively affect your score. The other is just total debt. So how much total borrowing you have, usually excluding a mortgage. And the higher your debt, usually, the more it will negatively impact your credit score. And another one is credit utilization, which is, again, it's quite a serious term, but it's how you're using your credit card. So if you think you've got a credit card with a credit limit of £1,000, the closer you get to spending £1,000 on that credit card, the more it will impact your credit score. So it's how you use your credit as well, not just the total debt that you have. And there's also some other things that just kind of impact overall your credit score, which is being on the electoral roll. That's good for your credit score. Good for ID checks as well when you apply for credit. And then also, not that it impacts your credit score, but if you're financially connected to anyone, that can impact credit applications when you make it because they can check the other person's information as well. And also the age of your accounts. This one's quite an important one because if you think about this, when you apply for credit, what a lender wants to see is a good history, a long history of managing credit well. So, if you've held your bank account for 10 years, we'll see 6 years of history on there. And as long as it looks good, that's where you get the most points. But if you have loads of new accounts, so you're just constantly opening up new accounts, 2, 3, 4 a year, you kind of bring down the average age of your accounts. And there's not much history yet for another lender to make a judgment on how well you're going to manage those accounts. So that's another important one.
That's really good to know and good for us to remember. I want to come back to the point that you made on credit utilization.
Yeah.
Credit has become a bigger part of our spending, and a big thing that has emerged in recent years is buy now, pay later.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to ask you then, could you explain to us how buy now, pay later affects our credit rating?
Yeah, it's a really good question because it's new. There's some misunderstanding around what it will impact and what it won't impact. But the important thing about buy now, pay later is although it can be good and it can be entirely affordable, every time you make a buy now, pay later purchase, that will show as an account on your credit report. And if you do that very regularly, suddenly you might have, it could be 10, 20, 30 accounts every month, depending on what you do. I mean, maybe you're shopping a lot, for example. But if that's the case, you want to be careful about doing that, especially if, 3 months down the line, a year down the line, you're applying for a mortgage. You want to probably try and avoid doing things like that, just so you can kind of keep a clean credit report, albeit you might be using it and paying it back on time. You just don't want to kind of throw in lots of new accounts that suddenly are included in your credit report. You just want to be a little bit cautious.
It's good to know that it shows up on your credit file as new accounts, because I think sometimes I've always said this, buy now, pay later, it can be a great tool like any other financial tool, but it's not always advertised as credit. This is a question that I know everyone listening is going to have on their minds is, what is a good credit score? Because I think everyone's aspiring to reach that good mark. So what is a good credit score and what should we be aiming for?
If you check your credit score with a credit reference agency, it will sit somewhere between 0 and 999. But the important part here is that you look at the credit score. That's a great indicator of how a lender would look at the information on your credit report and judge it effectively. But when you apply for credit, it works slightly differently because the lender will usually look at three things when you apply, which is the information on your credit report. They'll look at your affordability. So, all of your application form information, your salary, dependents, other expenses, and so on. They'll take that into account. And then their own records. So if you bank with them already or have done so recently, they'll also have some information on you. So they take all of that information, they calculate their own credit score for you. They won't tell you what it is. And the only way you'll really know is whether you get accepted for the account and whether you kind of get the rates that you want as well.
That is really good to know, genuinely, because sometimes, like I said, it can be confusing to know what to look for and what you're factoring in. If there's anyone who's listening who says, right, I've taken your advice, I've looked at my credit report, I've looked at my score. However, there's some things on there that just aren't correct, just incorrect information. What should you do about going about changing that information?
So it's quite simple to sort out problems with your credit report, and they're generally quite rare. If it's a mistake, you could come to Experian or a credit reference agency and just ask us to dispute that. So we take it on your behalf, get in touch with the lender, ask them to investigate. They then have to come back to us and just say, okay, yes, it's a mistake, please remove it, or we will remove it. Or if they come back, they might say, actually, it's correct. The only thing I would say to that is credit reports update from lenders monthly. So if it's something like credit card balance, for example, and you paid that off last week, the chances are it's not showing on your credit report yet. So there's no reason to, go through that process and dispute it. That's not really an error or a mistake. That just takes time to update. And then probably the last thing I'd say is it's a very similar process if you're the victim of ID fraud as well. You can contact us and we'll do it all on your behalf. So that makes that process a little bit easier too.
Absolutely. Right. I want to come to you because there are some credit myths that are very common. And with you here, I think we can dispel them. So what are some common credit score myths that you hear about that just absolutely are not true?
Yeah. So there's plenty of them. But I think the biggest one is that credit reference agencies make a lending decision, which we don't. So, when you apply for credit, the lender will look at the information on your credit report, along with other stuff like we talked about, so your application form and their own records. They make their own decision. They calculate their own credit score for you, and that just determines whether or not it's accepted. So actually, we don't have any involvement in the lending decision process at all. We just hold the information. And then the other one is that anyone you live with or anyone that you are in a relationship with will somehow affect your credit score in some way, which they don't, of course. Your credit score is personal. Where it gets a little bit grey is if you have had or applied for joint accounts with someone else. So what that does is that creates the financial link between the two of you. It's what we call a financial association. It's only created actually when you apply for a joint credit account together. So bank account, loan, something like that. Now, that doesn't affect your score, but the link means when you apply for credit in the future, a lender could check that person's information as well. And if they've not been good, then that could impact your application. It could mean that it's refused, or it could mean that maybe you pay more interest. So you can, if you're not linked, then you can remove that link. It's what we call a financial disassociation. You do it with all three credit reference agencies, really simple form, and you just get that link removed. And then the last one is that, and this is quite a big one, which is there's some type of list, some kind of blacklist.
That's a big one. I hear that all the time.
Yeah. So I think it's a real worry for people, which is that if they've had a problem, and a problem could be as, I'd say as minor, because, it's still negative, but let's call it minor, is missed payment. But if you have more serious issues, defaults, court judgments, and so on, there's a feeling that there's somehow a list where you suddenly go off and you apply for something and a lender says, no, sorry, you've had this, you're on the list, you can't get any credit now. But that doesn't exist at all. Now, the chances are, if you've got negative information on your report, you could still get credit. It will probably cost a little bit more because the interest rates will be higher. You might not be able to borrow as much, but if you do the research and find the lender that's more appropriate for you, then chances are you can still get credit.
I think that's going to put a lot of people's mind at ease, especially the last one about blacklisting. Before we round up then, I want to ask you, what are your top 3 tips for keeping a strong credit rating?
So my first tip would be check your credit report and score with all 3 credit reference agencies once a year. You do that just for a couple of reasons, which is you always get to know where you stand. So there's no big surprises when the time comes that you do apply for credit, but also you get to keep an eye out whether there's ID fraud in your name. Now, it's not all too common, but if it happens, at least you'll spot it and you get the chance to investigate that. So the next tip I would give anyone is just around how you manage your personal finances. So, lots of the credit score is just based around making your payments on time and keeping your debt low. So that means knowing your budget, knowing what you're spending and what's coming in and what's going out. And as long as you do that, you should be able to keep your repayments on time every month. And that's how you, over time, build a really healthy credit score. And then my third tip would be, if you're going to struggle to make minimum payments every month, then it's the right time to get some free help. So contacting a free debt advice charity like Step Change, National Debt Line, for example, they will help you through this process. And the worst thing that you could do is sit back and not deal with those issues. And, that's always easy to say, but it's a scary process. But there's nothing more relieving, I think, than picking up the phone or going online and chatting to a free debt advice charity, even if it's just for some help creating a budget. Because what that means is you don't then spend a year missing payments, possibly defaulting, and really negatively impacting your credit score, when actually if you get help at the very early stages, you can possibly avoid having years of a negative credit score.
Those were some incredible tips, especially the last one. I'm very big on encouraging people to seek advice and seek help as early as possible. Don't bury your head in the sand. If you need help, go for it and don't feel ashamed about it. So thank you so much.
Yeah.
This episode, I feel like I am now a credit scores expert, thanks to you. I feel like we've learned so much.
I agree. I've passed on my knowledge.
You
You're the
really
expert
have. I can wear that hat with you now as well. So thank you so much for coming onto the podcast.
Yeah, thank you. It's been great to be here.